The following weird incident took place in Liverpool in the early 1990s, and it has never been satisfactorily explained. It all started one foggy December evening in 1991. It was 7 p.m. on the Friday evening before Christmas when the Edwards family from Dovecot decided to go and do a bit of late Christmas shopping in Liverpool city centre. Mr. Edwards drove his wife and 4 children to town in his old Volvo estate, and as usual finding a place to park proved to be very difficult. Mr. Edwards drove around, searching desperately for a parking space as his 3 sons and daughter gazed excitedly at the spectacular Christmas lights and decorations lining the streets. The youngest of the Edwards family was Abby, who was only 6 years old, and she loved Christmas, and for days she'd been pestering her mum and dad to take her to see the big fir tree covered with coloured lights down on Church Street. Now, as Abby's dad was grumbling about finding a place to park the Volvo, her mum suddenly pointed to a secluded side street called Bold Place, which runs from Berry Street past the back of St Luke's Church up to Roscoe Street. Mr. Edwards sighed with relief, and he turned left into the poorly lit cobbled road, which lay on a bit of an incline. As soon as the car was parked, the 4 children eagerly jumped out of the vehicle and started pestering their parents about what they were getting for Christmas. Meanwhile, an icy fog rolled down the street. After checking that the doors of the car were locked, the 2 adults had a quick discussion about where they were going to go first. He wanted to go to his shop in Bold Street to buy his father a cardigan, but she insisted on going to Dixon's on Church Street first to buy a CD player for his sister. The children then started arguing too. Naturally, their first priority was to visit the various toy stores. When the father finally snapped, he said, "All right, that's enough, will you all just shut up?" And the whole family responded to the stress in his voice and quietened down, ready to set off. And suddenly Mr. Edwards noticed something, and his heart skipped a beat, and with a look of dread he glanced frantically about Bold Place and he yelled, "Where's Abby?" Everyone joined in the search for the lost child, anxiously looking through the windows of the car, but finding no one there. "Where on earth's she gone?" her mother pleaded with a trembling voice. The 3 boys looked desperately about, but the street was totally empty. At this point they all heard a faint voice screaming out in the distance, "Daddy! Daddy!" The voice sounded like Abby's, and it came from the top of Bold Place towards Roscoe Street. The family rushed up the cobbled road, with their father leading the way. "Abby!" he called. "Where are you?" The gates at the back of St Luke's were open, and he surmised that his daughter must have wandered into the precincts of the old church. He hurried into the grounds, followed closely by his wife and their sons, and once again they all heard Abby cry out for her father, but the little girl was nowhere to be seen, and the fog was getting thicker by the minute. And Mr. Edwards was reluctant to alarm his wife and children, but he secretly wondered if some perverted lunatic had grabbed his daughter and taken her into the ruins of the old church. He handed his wife the car keys, and he asked her to go and bring a torch from the vehicle. When she returned, he climbed up onto the ledge of a church window and he shone the flashlight into the deserted ruins. The interior was deserted, but nothing but rubble was scattered about, and he knew that this church of St Luke had been gutted by an incendiary bomb during the Second World War, during the Blitz. Only the shell of the building survived, and the church had been deliberately left that way as a sort of reminder of the war, and yet it sounded as if Abby's voice had come from inside the church. As Mrs. Edwards helped her husband down from the window, she put her finger to her lips. "Listen," she whispered. The faint eerie sound of a church organ was just audible, and it seemed to be emanating from the church. "Oh, Sam can play very funny tricks of the night," said her husband dismissively. "Come on, let's go and get the police." When his wife began to cry, he tried to reassure her. "It'll be all right, we'll find her, love. She can't have gone far." They set off for the police station in Hope Street, and there they reported their lost daughter to the desk sergeant, who alerted all the patrol cars in the area and told officers on the city centre beat to be on the lookout for the girl. The family then rushed back to Bold Place to resume their search for the girl. They scoured the grounds of St Luke's once again, and after 20 minutes they were about to return to their car when something happened which continues to puzzle them all to this day. A tall man wearing a top hat and a long black coat came out of the grounds of St Luke's, and walking with him was little Abby, holding his hand. And when Abby caught sight of her mum and dad, she ran to them. She started to cry, and as her father picked her up, the sinister man in black looked like something out of the Victorian age. He had long bushy sideburns, a pallid face, and staring ink-black eyes, and he stood like a statue outside the gates of the church, and in a creepy low voice the outdated-looking stranger addressed them.
"Please accept my sincere apology for any distress caused,"
he said. He then turned and walked silently back towards the rear of the church ruins. Mrs. Edwards grabbed Abby from her husband. "Are you all right? Where have you been?" she asked her frantically. "I'm fine, Mummy." Mr. Edwards was furious, and he shouted after the man, "Oi! Who are you? What's your game, eh?" Then a police car came tearing down the road, and he told the officers about the stranger who had returned his daughter. 3 of them bolted from the car and rushed into the grounds of the church, wielding their batons. But the police found no one. The grounds were completely empty. Reinforcements turned up, and the grounds were searched repeatedly with powerful torches, but the place was deserted. However, several police officers also heard the faint strains of a church organ playing somewhere nearby, but they were unable to determine just where the strange music was coming from. One of the policemen asked little Abby where she had been, and the child gave a strange account. She claimed that an old woman in a shawl had grabbed her hand, dragged her into the church where a mass was being celebrated. In the church there were many people dressed in old-fashioned clothing. The women wore big hats, and the men were all dressed in black. Abby had screamed for her father, but the old woman had put her hand over her mouth and silenced her. And some time later, she said, a tall man entered the church and pulled Abby from the old woman's clutches. He had been the man who had delivered Abby back to her parents. The intrigued policeman continued to interrogate the child, and he asked her if the man had spoken to her about the strange incident. Abby shook her head, then added that he had said that he had been a long time dead. Everyone went quiet when they heard the child's strange reply. Since the disturbing incident, the Edwards family refused to go anywhere near St Luke's Church, especially during the Christmas period. After recounting this unusual story on the radio, I received a lot of letters, phone calls and emails from people who had weird tales to tell about St Luke's. A man who worked in Rapid Hardware in Renshaw Street told me how he'd been driving to work early one morning when he saw St Luke's lit up on the inside by quaint-looking chandeliers. He could even see the stained glass windows, and decided that the church must have been renovated. However, when the witness glanced at the traffic lights out the corner of his left eye, he watched the illumination from St Luke's fade away. He turned to look back at the old church, and now he noticed that the windows had gone, and the place was in darkness once again. This was just one of the many accounts that I received regarding the church. A woman who worked in Lacey Street Job Centre up until the 1980s recently told me that during her lunch breaks she would often cross the road and enjoy a sandwich or a cigarette in the quiet grounds of St Luke's Church. On many occasions this woman and several other people present distinctly heard the faint hum of a church organ's bird-on note, the drone bass which always precedes a piece of organ music which would drift and reverberate round the shell of the empty church. I even received an alleged tape recording of this music, and it really did sound quite eerie. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. The city of Liverpool was being drenched by a biblical downpour as a gaggle of homeward-bound clubbers gathered round a bus shelter outside the Mardi Gras nightclub on Mount Pleasant. Taxis were whistled for, but they failed to stop. But suddenly a bus approached at that unearthly hour from the direction of the Shell station, coming from Lime Street. A 2 a.m. bus service was unheard of in 1966, but a young man, high on Purple Hearts, jokingly put his hand out, and to his great surprise the bus, bearing the number 12C, halted at the stop. This double-decker was painted black, its headlamps were of a faint gleaming amber, and the interior was in darkness, suggesting a drained battery or the activation of some power-saving mode on behalf of the driver. But that driver smiled and beckoned the 7 or 8 people to climb on board his vehicle. How altruistic! But such kindness is typical of Liverpool people. The upper deck was already full, so the newly embarked passengers sat and stood downstairs, and they chatted to one another while some lit up woodbines. "Where's the inspector?" asked the bemused 20-year-old man named Ray. His inner ears were still ringing from the music of the Mardi. Weighing up the situation, his fingers stroked his Van Dyke beard, as a blonde, twiggy look-alike seated opposite fidgeted with a loose false eyelash between her glances over at him. Stu, the 19-year-old on Purple Hearts, was leaning on the pole at the back of the bus, callously waving at the drenched folk being left behind on Mount Pleasant. All of a sudden there was a flash of lightning and hail began to pelt the bus. The number 12 accelerated at an incredible speed, and the inertia sent all those who had been standing down on the floor in a heap. Screams filled the vehicle. Ray saw the Georgian doorways of Oxford Street flitting past the windows, and fear made him swear.
"Slow down, will ya?"
He shouted towards the driver, but the engine continued its high-pitched whine, and the bus careered on an even faster trajectory through the driving rain. The twiggy twin was quickly reduced to tears, and she clutched the arms of another young woman seated next to her. Abercrombie Square whizzed by in a heart-stopping flash, and Stu was hanging from the pole at the back of the bus, sick with fear. Ray estimated the bus's speed as being somewhere in excess of over 80 miles per hour at least, and still it was accelerating, throwing up tidal waves of rainwater as its tyres passed through puddle lakes. What was that weird noise, barely audible over the roaring engine? The passengers upstairs were all laughing hysterically.
"I'm getting off. I only live in the bully,"
shouted the man with glasses on, trying to convince himself that this was a normal bus. The vehicle tore up the hill of Grinfield Street, and yet its engine didn't even labour one rev. And as the bus turned down Overton Street, it leaned sickeningly about 40 degrees to the right. Everyone on board thought his number was up. Everything tilted, but miraculously the bus righted itself on the wrong side of the road and screeched into a curve which almost took it through the windows of K. Nelson on Wavertree Road. People prayed, cried, and swore as the bus mounted the curve of the Picton Clock traffic island and flew on down to Chilwell. By now they calculated that it was travelling at around 120 miles per hour, and the petite blonde threw up all over Ray as he edged to the back of the bus, wondering if he dared to leap off the platform, where Stu was clinging on for dear life with his arms and legs wrapped around the bar and his eyes clenched shut. Ray wondered why the maniac driving the bus was going so fast, and how was he managing to go so fast? Surely it was impossible for a double-decker to reach such fantastic speeds. He suddenly felt a strange impulse to look up, and there on the shadowy stairs stood a pale-faced individual whom he immediately recognised, an individual who'd been dead for over a decade, Mr. Ryan, the dirty old man who had lived next door to Ray when he was a child. Ray found himself taking his nan's rosary beads from his inside pocket, feeding them through his fingers as he recited the Lord's Prayer out loud. The middle-aged man who wanted to get off at the bull ring quickly joined in. It was obvious to Ray that this black bus, which could travel at speeds no corporation bus could ever attain, had to have something to do with the supernatural, the devil himself perhaps. Ray suddenly had the sickening conviction that the passengers on the top deck were all dead people, and bad dead people at that. "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done," Ray shouted, now directing the prayer at the silhouetted driver, and sure enough the bus started to slow down, finally coming to a halt on Chilwell Valley Road. The passengers scrambled to disembark as quickly as they could, some shaking with fear and others with fury at having been subjected to such an ordeal. Stu tried to prise open the door of the bus driver's cab, intending to give him a good pasting, but the vehicle's demonic engine began to throb as it stared back into life, and as a ghostly mist invaded the valley of Chilwell, the black bus moved off, and in full view of the traumatised passengers from Mount Pleasant, the vehicle faded away into nothingness as it passed under the railway bridge that spanned the road. Over the years I have received many strange accounts of a phenomenon called the 3 knocks of death. The weird thing is that these uncanny incidents have been reported all over the world. In 1979, a Mrs. Hughes of Everton tells the story of how she heard 3 loud raps on her front door in St. Domingo Grove. And she was in the hallway in close proximity to the door when she heard the knock, so she opened it within a few seconds. There was no one there, which did not really surprise her, she said, because she hadn't heard the sound of her squeaky front gate being opened, which usually warned her of impending visits. She closed the door, feeling slightly perplexed, and then she glanced at the clock and she noted the time was exactly 11 p.m. Now, half an hour later, there was another knock on the door, and this time Mrs. Hughes was confronted by 2 policemen who both had very grave expressions on their faces. She soon understood why when they gave her the tragic news that her husband Bobby had been knocked down and killed that evening in Netherfield Road. Now, 2 years later, Mrs. Hughes was watching news at 10 one night when she and her daughter both heard 3 loud raps on the kitchen window. Now, this obviously should have meant that someone was out in the yard trying to get their attention, but when they stepped outside to search the backyard, it was completely empty. 15 minutes later, Mrs. Hughes opened the front door and was horrified to find the body of her brother lying dead on the front step. It was later found that he had died from heart failure. Now, a retired fireman in Lower Bevington named Frank once related to me how his neighbour had told him about hearing 3 knocks on the wall at his house, which always seemed to be a warning of tragic news, and Frank dismissed his claims as pure superstition. But a few months later he heard 3 knocks on the wall of his own living room one afternoon, and his neighbours were out shopping, so he knew that they could not have been tapping on the wall. And then minutes later the telephone rang and he was told the awful news that his divorced wife had committed suicide. Now, when I first mentioned these cases on the Billy Butler show on Radio Merseyside, I received quite a few letters, and I mean, this is just a few of them. I got one from a Mrs. Hennessy up in Anfield. She said, 2 days before my dad died, I was in bed around 5 a.m. when I distinctly heard 3 knocks on my bedstead. And when I told my mum about this, she made the sign of the cross, saying 3 knocks is a sure sign of a death. And it actually did come true, you know, a father died. There was also a letter from a Mrs. Jean Morrison of Tuebrook, who wrote to tell me that in 1967, she said, I was sitting with my nan one night, I was 10 at the time, when we both heard 3 loud raps on the ceiling. This is the ceiling in the living room. We were the only 2 in the house at the time, and I asked my nan if it was someone messing about, and she said, that was no human hand, love. That means someone there is about to die. And the next day, the neighbour, a man in his 20s, had an accident on a building site in Widnes, and he literally bled to death. And Jean said she lived in mortal fear of hearing these 3 knocks of death for years. I also got a letter from Elisa MacDonald of Ayton. Now, she said in 2010 she was in bed. She had a really bad case of the flu, and this was around 11 p.m. She had 3 raps on her upstairs bedroom window. Now, she thought she saw a fist at the window for a moment. She went to the window. There was no one in the street outside. She picked up a mobile phone. She phoned her mum, who told her it had been the 3 knocks of death, and Lisa thought her mum was just joking. But that night, at 11 p.m, Lisa's uncle had died of a massive heart attack at a bus stop in Liverpool city centre, and he was only 41. Now, these reports of the 3 knocks of death are intriguing, and they do hint that sometimes death does give a warning.